Autumn leaves swirled across the schoolyard as laughter shattered the calm. A little girl with a metal leg sat on a stone bench, tears streaming down her face, while a boy lifted her crutches high above his head, shouting, "Robot girl!" as his friends laughed with cruel delight behind him. From a distance, her father, Jack Carter, a war veteran, stopped in his tracks. His loyal German shepherd, Rex, growled low, sensing the pain that words could cut deeper than any wound. Jack had seen cruelty on battlefields, but never like this, never aimed at his own child. That moment would change everything, setting in motion a story about courage, compassion, and the quiet strength that can rise from heartbreak. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Let's see how far courage of the heart can travel. It was a quiet noon in late autumn at Silver Creek Elementary, where the air carried that gentle chill between summer's warmth and winter's promise. The playground shimmered beneath a canopy of scarlet maple leaves, each one spinning slowly down like fragments of fading sunlight. Children's voices rang across the courtyard, high, cheerful, ordinary. Yet at the far edge, near a stone bench mottled with shadow, a little girl sat apart from it all, her hands folded in her lap as if holding the silence together. Her name was Emily Carter, 8 years old, slender, with a small face framed by bright blonde hair that caught the light when she lifted her head. She wore a navy blue school uniform, neat but a little faded, and where her left leg should have been was a polished metal prosthetic that gleamed faintly under the sun. Ryan Miller, a boy from her class with restless eyes and a sharp grin, noticed her sitting there. He was the kind of boy who spoke before he thought, loud enough for others to laugh, and he liked the sound of his own voice when people listened. Behind him stood half a dozen classmates in matching uniforms, faces half hidden behind the leaves' red glow. Ryan whispered something, the others giggled, and then he strode forward toward Emily, the fallen leaves crunching under his shoes. "Hey, robot girl," he said, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. The laughter that followed spread quickly, rippling through the group like a spark on dry grass. Emily flinched at the word, though she had heard it before. Her fingers curled on the bench, pressing against the cold stone. She tried to smile, tried to keep her voice steady, but no words came out. When she bent to reach for the crutches leaning beside her, Ryan was faster. He snatched them up with both hands and lifted them high above his head like a trophy. "Look, she can't even stand without these," he shouted, the crutches gleaming under the maple light. Behind him, the children broke into laughter again, bright, sharp, merciless, the kind of laughter that leaves a mark you can't wash away. Emily's lips trembled. She didn't beg or scream. She just lowered her head and stared at the ground, her tears falling silently onto the scattered leaves. For a moment, the world seemed to grow still except for the rustling above her. One of the girls behind Ryan hesitated, her smile fading, but no one said a word. The crutches clattered as Ryan spun them once, pretending to balance them like a juggler, and the laughter resumed, louder, freer, crueler. Far across the playground, near the parking lot, Jack Carter was walking toward the school gate. He was a tall man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded olive-green field jacket and a black cap with white-stitched letters that read, "Veteran." His dark hair was touched with gray, his face tanned and lined, the kind of face that looked like it had seen more than it wanted to remember. Beside him trotted Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd, his coat a deep mix of sable and tan, his movements alert yet calm. Jack had served in Iraq, where he'd learned to read silence before danger. So when he saw a circle of children forming under the maple tree and heard the sound of laughter that didn't sound like joy, something inside him stiffened. Rex noticed it first. The dog's ears pricked forward, muscles tensing, a low growl vibrating through his chest. Jack followed his gaze and froze. Through the sea of red leaves and blue uniforms, he saw his daughter. She was crying, sitting small and helpless on the stone bench, while a boy held her crutches above his head like a prize. For a brief, burning second, Jack felt the old instinct, the one that came before orders and training, to run. He didn't need to think. He just moved. "Rex!" he called sharply, and the German shepherd shot ahead, bounding over the scattered leaves, the sudden bark cutting through the laughter like a blade. The children stumbled back in fright, Ryan dropping the crutches with a startled cry. They clattered against the ground beside Emily's feet. Rex stopped just short of the bench, hackles raised, amber eyes fixed on the group. Jack arrived seconds later, breathing hard but composed. His face was pale under the brim of his cap, his jaw tight as he crouched down beside his daughter. The air still smelled of fallen leaves and chalk dust, but now it carried something else: shame, confusion, fear. Emily buried her face in her hands. "Why am I different, Dad?" she sobbed, her small voice trembling. Jack reached out, lifting her chin gently. His eyes softened even as his chest tightened. "Different doesn't mean less," he said quietly. "It means stronger." The words came out steady, simple, but his throat ached as he said them. For a moment there was only the sound of wind stirring through the branches and the faint click of Rex's claws on the pavement as the dog circled once, standing guard. A woman approached from the doorway. The teacher, Ms. Alden, a woman in her mid-30s with her hair pulled into a neat bun and an air of weary politeness. She looked at Jack, then at the children still frozen in place. "Mr. Carter," she began, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "They're just children. They didn't mean any harm." Jack stood slowly, his hands still steadying Emily as she reached for her crutches. He looked at the teacher, his voice calm but cold. "People always say that," he said, "until one of those children can't take it anymore." The words hung there, heavy and real. Ms. Alden said nothing. Behind her, Ryan stared at the ground, his face pale. No one moved, even the wind seemed to pause. Then Jack turned away, guiding Emily's hand to the crutch handle, helping her rise. She stood shakily, but upright, her small frame silhouetted against the red canopy of the maple. Rex walked beside her, tail low, eyes watchful. Jack placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, and together they walked out of the playground. The leaves whispered under their feet, the laughter gone now, replaced by a silence that felt almost sacred. Behind them, the children stayed still, watching without words as the father, the daughter, and the loyal dog disappeared beyond the gate. The last thing they saw was the sunlight glinting off the metal of Emily's leg, a brief flash of steel beneath the autumn red, before it vanished into the quiet beyond the schoolyard. The next morning came with a gray sky over Silver Creek Elementary, the air damp and quiet, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The playground, once filled with laughter, was subdued now, though whispers carried easily through the corridors. People always remembered stories that sounded dramatic, not the truth that hurt quietly. By the time the bell rang, the rumor had already changed shape. It wasn't that a girl had been mocked, but that her father, the veteran, had lost his temper. "The soldier who scared the kids," they said. No one mentioned Emily's tears or how long she had sat there. Rumors were lighter than truth. They floated farther, faster, and landed where no one wanted them. In the teacher's lounge, Ms. Alden sat with two colleagues, her cup of coffee untouched, steam fading into the morning chill. She wasn't a cruel woman, but she feared trouble, the kind that made principals call for explanations. "He's protective," one teacher said, "but maybe he overreacted." Alden nodded faintly, her expression tight. She told herself she'd handled it well, that these things happened, that children forgot. Yet she couldn't forget the look on Jack Carter's face, the quiet fury behind restraint, the kind that didn't shout, only hurt. And somewhere deep down, she knew she had failed the little girl who looked at her for help. That afternoon, the principal called her in for a brief meeting. Papers rustled, voices low, careful. No one wanted conflict with a veteran. No one wanted headlines. The decision was unspoken but clear. Let things settle. Let the story fade. Afterward, Alden walked back to her classroom, where Emily was quietly arranging her pencils. The girl's face was calm, too calm for her age. Alden stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking softly. "Emily," she said, "maybe it would be better if we moved you to another class for a while. A fresh start." Emily looked up, confused. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. Alden hesitated, then smiled faintly. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes it's just easier that way." Outside, the wind picked up, scattering maple leaves across the path that led to the parking lot. Jack Carter stood by his truck, waiting. He saw the way Ms. Alden's hand rested gently on Emily's shoulder as she walked out and understood more than he wanted to. Emily didn't say anything as she climbed into the truck. The silence between them was soft but heavy, like unspoken words pressing against the glass. Jack started the engine. the radio humming faintly with an old country song about home and loss. Halfway down the road, Emily asked, "Are they mad at you, Dad?" He didn't answer at first, just tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "People get nervous when they don't understand," he said finally. "They talk so they don't have to think." That night, the Carter house stood still at the edge of town, surrounded by whispering trees. The porch light glowed weakly, casting a small circle on the wooden floorboards. Inside, the house was modest, the kind of place built by hands that had worked and repaired and made do. Emily sat near the doorway, her crutches leaning against the wall, trying to balance her steps without them. 1, 2, pause. Her face tightened each time she shifted her weight. Jack sat on the porch just outside, his silhouette framed by the glow of his cigarette. He didn't smoke much, only when the silence got too loud. Rex lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, ears flicking at every small sound. Jack's eyes followed his daughter through the open door. The rhythm of her uneven steps struck him harder than any memory of war. Out there, he had been trained to keep men alive. In here, he couldn't stop his little girl from being hurt by the world. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint thud of her practice, slow, steady, relentless. When the cigarette burned out, he crushed it gently between his fingers, stood up, and watched her take another step. "Easy, Em," he murmured. She smiled faintly without turning around. "I'm fine, Dad. Rex is watching." The dog lifted his head as if agreeing, his tail brushing softly against the porch. As the evening deepened, the sound of footsteps echoed in the gravel path outside. It was Clara Johnson, the school custodian, a woman around 60 with graying curls tucked under a faded scarf. She carried a mop and a paper bag that smelled faintly of apple pie. Clara was one of those souls who spoke little and saw much. Life had taught her quiet wisdom. Her husband gone too early, her years spent caring for other people's children in hallways that never remembered her name. She stopped by the fence, watching Emily struggle upright again, and smiled gently. "Evening, Jack," she called. Her voice was rough but kind. "She's practicing late, huh?" Jack nodded, a tired half smile tugging at his lips. "She says she'll walk without the crutches by Christmas." Clara leaned her mop against the railing, stepping closer. "Then she's got more spirit than most folks I know." She glanced at Emily and added softly, "You tell her from me, the strongest people aren't the ones everyone cheers for. They're the ones who keep standing, even when nobody's looking." Her words floated through the doorway, landing gently in the quiet room. Emily looked up from her practice, breathing hard but smiling. "Thank you, Miss Clara," she said, her voice small but sure. Clara winked, then turned to leave, her mop tapping against the porch steps. Jack watched her go, her figure fading into the dark, the faint smell of apple pie lingering in the air. Inside, Emily took one more step, then another, a little steadier this time. Jack stood there for a long while, not speaking, not moving, just watching the way she lifted herself each time she swayed. He didn't realize he was smiling until Rex nudged his leg, tail thumping softly. The wind rustled through the trees again, scattering the last of the maple leaves across the yard. When Emily finally stopped, she set her crutches aside and sat by the door, sweat on her forehead but a calm pride in her eyes. "I think I did better tonight," she said. Jack crouched beside her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "You did," he said quietly. "You always do." Outside, Rex lay down beside them, head on Emily's knee, eyes closing contentedly. The night had no need for more words. The stars above Silver Creek blinked faintly through thin clouds, and somewhere in the dark, a sense of peace settled, not because the pain was gone, but because they were learning how to live with it. The days that followed grew colder as autumn leaned toward winter, and the trees along Silver Creek shed the last of their red leaves. The school tried to move on, the way small towns often did, by pretending nothing had happened. But gossip had long roots, and the silence that replaced it felt heavier than words. To soften the talk around town, the principal announced a new campaign, Kindness Week. There were banners in the hall, posters on the doors, and a morning announcement that said kindness was the heart of Silver Creek Elementary. But slogans never made people kind. They only made them quieter. Emily walked the same halls as everyone else, but she might as well have been invisible. Her desk sat near the window, her books always neatly stacked, her eyes always on the board. When she raised her hand to answer a question, a few students exchanged glances and snickered. The sound was soft, but sharp enough to cut. Ms. Alden at the front of the class hesitated for half a second, then turned toward another student. "Anyone else?" she asked. Emily lowered her hand slowly, cheeks burning, her throat tight. It wasn't cruelty that hurt most. It was being unseen. At lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with laughter and chatter. Emily sat alone, as usual, her sandwich untouched. From the far end of the room, a boy dropped his milk carton near her table, glanced at her leg, and looked away too quickly. She tried to pretend she hadn't noticed, but she always did. Outside the window, the wind moved through the maple trees, scattering leaves like confetti that had lost its celebration. In the far corner of the cafeteria, the custodian swept quietly, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he'd seen all this before and knew it would pass. His name was Mr. Lowell. He was in his early 70s, tall but slightly stooped, his shoulders broad beneath a worn navy jacket with faded patches that hinted at his past. A former Marine, he had the look of a man who had once carried too much weight and never really put it down. His hands were rough, his voice low, his eyes a shade of gray that could be stern or kind depending on the moment. Most children never paid him much attention, but he noticed everything, especially the quiet ones. That afternoon, when the cafeteria emptied and he found Emily still sitting at her table, tracing circles on her lunch tray, he stopped sweeping. He didn't ask why she stayed behind. He didn't need to. "Long day?" he asked instead, his tone calm, matter-of-fact. Emily nodded, not looking up. "They laughed again," she said softly. Mr. Lowell leaned on his broom, his mouth twitching like a man remembering a scar. "You know, kid," he said, "people think courage makes noise. But the real kind, the kind that counts, doesn't shout. It just keeps showing up." Emily looked up at him for the first time, her eyes curious. "So I just keep showing up?" He smiled faintly. "Exactly. You don't need them to see it. You just need to keep walking." The next day, after school, she found him in the maintenance shed behind the gym. It smelled of sawdust and paint, the air thick with the scent of metal polish. Mr. Lowell was sanding an old chair, humming an off-key tune. When he saw Emily at the door, he set down his work. "You ready to make something yours?" he asked. She frowned slightly. "Like what?" He nodded toward her crutches. "Those things carry you every day. Maybe it's time they look like they belong to someone strong." She blinked, unsure, then smiled. "Okay." They worked together in the fading light. Mr. Lowell laid down a drop cloth while Emily held the crutches steady. The old silver paint peeled away under gentle strokes, revealing the raw metal beneath. "Hold it firm," he said, guiding her hand. "You want it smooth before you make it shine." When the new coat went on, a deep, gleaming silver that caught the setting sun, it looked less like medical steel and more like armor. Mr. Lowell took a small engraving tool from his pocket, the kind soldiers once used to mark their gear, and began to carve words near the handle. "Never bow down." He didn't explain. He didn't have to. When they finished, the crutches gleamed softly under the porch light. Emily ran her hand along the cool metal, tracing the letters with her fingertip. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Mr. Lowell shrugged. "It's a reminder," he said. "Not for them. For you." He packed up the tools and nodded toward her. "Go on, try them out." She took a few careful steps across the grass, each one a little steadier than the last. The sound of the crutches against the ground was light, almost musical. Mr. Lowell watched with quiet pride, his hands in his pockets, his face softened by the dusk. Over the next few days, Emily walked home alone as she always did, her silver crutches catching the sunlight like twin streaks of light among the falling leaves. The same children passed her in the hall, the same whispers trailed behind her. But something had shifted. She didn't walk faster or hold her head higher. She simply moved forward, step after step, calm, certain, untouchable. The words, "never bow down," seemed to echo with each click of metal on pavement. Each afternoon, a few students paused as she crossed the yard under the maple trees, the red leaves swirling around her like sparks from a fire that refused to die. They didn't know what had changed, only that she no longer looked breakable. There was a steadiness in her that made noise seem small. Ryan, standing near the bike rack, watched her pass one day. His friends laughed at something else entirely, but he didn't join them. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable, as the girl with the silver crutches disappeared into the amber light beyond the gate. When the last bell of the week rang, the banners for Kindness Week fluttered in the wind, their bright colors fading against the gray sky. No one remembered what they said. But in one corner of the schoolyard, under the oldest maple tree, a pair of silver crutches leaned against the bench where a little girl used to cry. They gleamed like quiet proof that strength doesn't always roar, and that sometimes the smallest steps are the bravest ones. It began on a Friday afternoon, one of those gray hours when the sky feels heavy with unspoken warnings. The leaves that had turned crimson now blew in frantic circles, and the air smelled of rain and cold metal. The children at Silver Creek Elementary pressed their faces to the window as the clouds folded into one another like bruised skin. The storm had been forecasted, but no one expected it to come this fast. By the time the last bell rang, the first cracks of thunder were already rolling through the valley. Teachers shouted over the noise, trying to usher the children toward buses that trembled in the rising wind. In room 3B, the lights flickered, and the rain began to hammer against the glass. Ms. Alden, nervous but composed, checked her list of names twice. "Stay together, everyone," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. But the storm drowned her words. The hallway outside was a blur of umbrellas, footsteps, and panic. When she turned to close the window, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the hall. She flinched, and in that instant, the classroom door slammed shut, its frame swollen by the sudden downpour. A few children screamed. The power went out. Inside, the dim light from the emergency bulb cast everything in pale amber. Emily stood near her desk, her silver crutches glinting faintly as rain began to leak through the ceiling tiles. Water pooled on the floor, turning the air cold and electric. Ryan, who had been near the back, stumbled as part of the plaster came loose. He hit the ground with a cry, clutching his leg. "I can't move," he gasped. The other children froze, fear darting between them like sparks. Ms. Alden pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The frame groaned, the handle slick with water. She turned back, breathless. "Stay calm," she said, though her eyes betrayed her worry. Emily's hands tightened around her crutches. She looked at Ryan, lying near the puddle, his face twisted in pain. For a moment she hesitated, the fear of falling, the memory of laughter, the weight of all those eyes. Then she took a step. The metal tips clicked against the wet floor, steady and sure, each sound louder than the thunder outside. "Hold on," she said softly. The other kids watched as she moved toward him, her prosthetic leg slipping once, then catching again. The water rose around her shoes, but she didn't stop. She knelt beside him, her breath short, and slid one crutch beneath his arm. "We can do this together." Ryan tried to protest, but she shook her head. "Lean on me." Inch by inch they made their way toward the front, her movements deliberate, every step a small act of defiance against fear itself. The ceiling dripped in steady rhythm, the windows rattled, and then another sound, deep and sharp, a branch slamming into the glass. The pane cracked, spiderwebbing across the frame. Ms. Alden covered her head and called out, "Get down!" The children crouched. Under desks as the window gave way, rain and wind bursting through like an open wound. Emily shielded Ryan with her body, pressing close to the floor, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it. Far from the school, Jack Carter had been listening to the weather report on the truck radio when static filled the air. He turned up the volume, hearing a panicked voice mention Silver Creek Elementary, power outage, classrooms flooded. His breath caught. In the passenger seat, Rex whined, sensing the shift before Jack even spoke. "Hang on, buddy," Jack muttered, slamming the gear into drive. The truck skidded on wet pavement, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. His mind ran faster than the wipers, replaying every time Emily had said she wasn't afraid. He'd believed her, but he also knew storms have a way of testing belief. When Jack reached the school, the parking lot was half submerged. He ran through the water, the wind tearing at his jacket, Rex bounding beside him. The halls were dark, echoing with distant voices. He found Ms. Alden near the stairwell, soaked and shaking, trying to break open a classroom door with a chair leg. "They're still inside," she cried. Jack didn't hesitate. He nodded once, then stepped back, measuring the frame. Rex barked sharply, circling, ears pinned flat. Jack swung his shoulder hard into the door, once, twice, and on the third hit, it splintered open. The sight inside froze him. The desks were half flooded, papers floating like fallen feathers. In the center, Emily stood with one crutch missing, holding Ryan upright, both trembling, both drenched. When she saw him, her face broke, not with fear, but with relief so deep it almost looked like pain. "Dad," she called, her voice hoarse. He waded through the water, scooping her into his arms, the weight of her small frame a reminder that she was still here, still fighting. Rex waded past him, grabbing Ryan's jacket in his jaws and pulling him toward the door. The boy cried out, startled, but then realized the dog was steadying him, dragging him to safety. Outside, the storm howled louder than ever. Jack carried Emily across the courtyard, his boots sloshing through puddles that reached his knees. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment everything was white. The father, the daughter, the dog, framed against the torrent. They reached the truck, Ryan limping behind with Rex at his side. When Jack set Emily down beneath the shelter of the open door, she clutched Rex's soaked fur and began to cry. "See, Dad," she said between sobs. "He didn't break the rules. He saved them." Jack brushed the wet hair from her face, his voice low but certain. "Sometimes," he said, "breaking the rule is how you save the world." By dawn, the rain had eased, leaving behind silence and wreckage. The school stood battered but unbroken, the maple trees stripped bare. Someone had filmed part of the rescue through the window, shaky clip showing the man, the girl, and the dog in the storm. By morning, it had spread across Silver Creek, played in diners and church halls, shared on old phones and televisions that still worked. People watched quietly, some with tears they didn't expect. No one mentioned the rumors anymore. They just saw a father carrying his daughter through the rain, a dog saving a boy, and a little girl who refused to fall. The sun returned to Silver Creek with the quiet gentleness that always follows a storm. The schoolyard, once littered with broken branches and puddles, now glimmered under the soft light of late autumn. The banners had been re-hung, this time not for Kindness Week, but for something new, the Day of Compassion. Rows of folding chairs lined the yard, the flag rippled in a steady breeze, and a small wooden stage had been built beneath the oldest maple tree. Children in fresh uniforms filled the seats, their chatter rising and falling like a tide. Somewhere behind the microphone, the principal rehearsed a speech written in careful, hopeful words. Emily Carter stood near the edge of the crowd, her silver crutches glinting faintly. Her dress was simple, cream with a blue ribbon at the waist, and her blonde hair had been brushed smooth, though a few strands still caught the wind. She shifted her weight, adjusting her prosthetic leg, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. Beside her sat Rex, wearing a clean collar that Jack had polished that morning. The tag caught the sunlight, flickering like a small flame. The dog's ears were up, his gaze alert, as if he knew the day meant something important. The principal, a man in his 50s with a kind but cautious face, tapped the microphone. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "Today we gather not to remember fear, but courage. Not to dwell on what went wrong, but to celebrate what went right." His voice trembled slightly as he glanced toward Emily. "Sometimes bravery doesn't wear a uniform or carry a medal. Sometimes it's a little girl who walks through the rain for someone else." The crowd stirred, and soft applause followed, hesitant at first, then growing warmer. When Emily's name was called, the students turned to watch as she made her way toward the stage. Each step echoed faintly against the wooden floorboards. A teacher helped her onto the platform, but she shook her head gently. She wanted to stand on her own. The principal smiled and placed a small medal around her neck. It was simple, a silver heart etched with the words, "Heart of Courage." The ribbon brushed her shoulder as the wind picked up again, carrying the sound of clapping across the courtyard. "And to her loyal friend," the principal added, looking toward Rex, "who reminded us all that loyalty has no words." A ripple of laughter, light and sincere this time, followed as Rex barked once, tail wagging proudly. At the edge of the stage, Ryan Miller stood waiting, his left leg still bandaged beneath his jeans. He looked smaller somehow, not in size but in spirit. When the microphone was passed to him, he hesitated, the paper in his hands trembling. Then he took a deep breath. "I used to think being strong meant laughing at others," he said. His voice cracked but didn't falter. "But now I know it means standing up for them. I saw someone do that when it was hardest, and she wasn't even trying to prove anything." He glanced toward Emily. "She just did what was right." The silence that followed was soft but powerful, the kind that said more than any cheer could. From her place in the crowd, Ms. Alden felt something tighten in her chest. She had worn her best gray coat, her hair pinned neatly, her expression composed. Yet as she watched the girl she had once overlooked standing tall on that stage, guilt pressed against her ribs like a memory that refused to fade. When the ceremony ended, she walked forward, weaving through the crowd until she stood in front of Emily. "Emily," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I should have spoken when it mattered." The girl blinked in surprise, then smiled, small, gentle, forgiving. "It's okay, Miss Alden," she said. "You're speaking now." Near the back of the courtyard, Jack Carter stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, the brim of his veteran cap shading his eyes. He didn't step forward or wave when Emily looked his way. He simply watched, a quiet pride resting in his posture. Rex stood beside him, head slightly tilted, tail swaying slowly. Jack reached down, scratching behind the dog's ear. "We did it, old friend," he murmured, his voice soft enough to be lost in the wind. "We really did." The dog leaned into his hand, eyes closing for a moment, the bond between them wordless and whole. As the crowd began to disperse, the narrator's voice might have said, if anyone had been listening, that heroes rarely look like the stories we tell about them. Some wear medals, others wear scars. And some, like a little girl beneath the maple tree, walk on silver crutches that shine brighter than any award. The leaves swirled around her feet as if the earth itself was clapping quietly, knowing that kindness, once real, never fades, it only changes shape. Emily stepped off the stage, her medal catching the light, her father and Rex waiting at the end of the path. The three of them walked together beneath the arching branches, the world still damp from the storm, but bright with new sunlight. The leaves fell gently over their shoulders, red, gold, and brown, settling on Rex's fur and on the silver of Emily's crutches. She looked up at her father, smiling. "Do you think people really change, Dad?" Jack nodded, his voice calm. "They do, sweetheart, when someone's brave enough to start it." The path from the school led down toward the small bridge where the creek ran shallow and clear. Jack slowed his pace, glancing once more at the building behind them. The faint sound of children's laughter drifted through the air, softer now, but lighter too. He turned back toward Emily, her steps steady, her spirit unbroken. The maple leaves danced around them as they crossed the bridge, sunlight glinting on the engraved words along the crutches. "Never bow down." For a moment, it looked as though the entire world bowed to her instead. At the end of this story, we are reminded that kindness does not always roar, and heroes do not always stand in the spotlight. Sometimes, compassion appears in quiet acts, a father's steady hand, a child's gentle courage, a dog's silent loyalty. The strength of humanity is not in power, but in the willingness to lift others even when no one is watching. Let this story remind us that every small act of goodness can light a dark place in someone's heart. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us what kindness means to you. Remember to subscribe for more true stories of love, courage, and second chances. May God bless everyone who watches with an open heart.